Prodigious black girl asks famous millionaire to play piano at party. His response is unexpected. Are you sure that this child should be here? Whispered Victoria Ashworth to the event organizer, discreetly pointing to the 8-year-old girl who was staring in fascination at the Steinway grand piano in the center of the hall. The Ashworth Foundation's annual charity gala brought together Manhattan's elite in the city's most expensive penthouse. Tycoons, celebrities, and politicians mingled among works of art that cost more than entire houses, while waiters served champagne worth $1,000 a bottle. Jade Thompson was only there because her mother, Carmen, was working as the catering supervisor for the event. The girl had begged to accompany her mother, promising to stay quietly in a corner, but her eyes couldn't stray from the magnificent instrument that dominated the room. "Mom, look at that piano," Jade whispered, discreetly tugging at Carmen's uniform sleeve. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Carmen looked around nervously, noticing a few curious glances turning toward them. "Jade, remember what we talked about? You need to stay quiet and invisible, okay? This job is very important to us." What neither of them could have imagined was that Vincent Ashworth, the billionaire host of the party, had noticed the girl's fixation on the piano from the moment she entered the hall. At 55, he had built a real estate empire based on exclusivity and tradition, values he proudly upheld. "Carmen," called the catering coordinator, motioning for her to come closer. "Mr. Ashworth wants to talk to you. Now." Carmen's heart raced. In 10 years of organizing elite events, she knew that when the host wanted to talk to an employee during the party, it was rarely good news. Jade watched her mother walk away with tense steps and turned her attention back to the piano. Without realizing it, she began to slowly approach the instrument, as if drawn by a magnetic force. Her small, delicate fingers almost touched the keys when a deep voice cut through the air behind her. "And you think you can play that, little girl?" Jade turned and found Vincent Ashworth standing a few feet away, his imposing posture and condescending smile making her feel even smaller. Around them, some conversations quieted, curious people beginning to pay attention to the situation. I was just looking, sir," Jade replied, her voice almost a whisper. "Looking?" Vincent laughed, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Child, this piano is worth more than the house you live in. It's not a toy." The remark provoked discreet giggles from some of the nearby guests. Jade felt her cheeks grow hot, but something in her eyes showed no shame, it was determination. "I can play," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Can I show you?" The silence that followed was almost palpable. Vincent Ashworth raised an eyebrow, genuinely amused by the girl's audacity. In the distance, Carmen watched in horror, knowing that her daughter had just crossed a dangerous line. "You know how to play?" Vincent repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And where exactly would a girl like you learn classical piano?" There, under the weight of dozens of condescending glances and mocking smiles, Jade stood firm, guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the time was right. Her eyes sparkled with a confidence that didn't match her 8 years of age, as if she knew something that all those rich adults could never imagine. If you've ever been underestimated because of your appearance or background, then you know that sometimes it takes more than words to prove your worth. Subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple question from a child would turn a night of prejudice into a moment no one would ever forget. Vincent Ashworth laughed loudly, a sound that echoed through the hall and made several heads turn. "Where would you learn classical piano?" he repeated, gesturing theatrically. "On YouTube? On some mobile app?" Laughter spread among the nearby guests. A platinum-haired lady whispered something to her friend, both looking at Jade with expressions of pity mixed with amusement. "Vincent, dear," said Victoria Ashworth, approaching with a glass of champagne in her hand. "Why are you wasting your time with this? We have important investors waiting to talk to you." But Vincent was clearly enjoying himself. No, I want to hear it. Tell us all, little one, where exactly would a girl in your situation learn classical piano?" Jade felt all the words she wanted to say catch in her throat. How could she explain that 3 years ago, when her mother worked cleaning offices at night, she had discovered an abandoned piano in the basement of a commercial building? How could she tell them that she spent hours practicing in silence, wearing headphones connected to the electric keyboard her mother had bought used for $50? "My teacher taught me," she finally replied, her voice small but firm. "Teacher?" Vincent raised an eyebrow. "And where does this teacher teach?" "At your neighborhood public school." The comment provoked more giggles. Jade lowered her eyes, remembering Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, the retired pianist who lived in the apartment next door. 3 nights a week, after Carmen came home exhausted from work, the 72-year-old woman would open her door to Jade and her little digital keyboard. "You don't understand," Jade muttered, more to herself than to Vincent. "Don't understand what?" Vincent crouched down, bringing himself to her height with a patronizing smile. "Listen, little one. This piano," he tapped the polished wood lightly, "is a 1942 Steinway. It's worth over $500,000. Great pianists have played on it. You really think you can just come in here and—" "Vincent." Carmen's voice cut through the air like a knife. She had approached silently, her face pale but controlled. "Jade, come here." "Ah, the mother," Vincent straightened up, his smile becoming even more condescending. "Carmen, isn't it? We need to have a talk about boundaries and proper supervision." Carmen placed her hand protectively on Jade's shoulder. "I apologize, Mr. Ashworth." Jade was just impressed by the piano. She didn't mean any disrespect. "Disrespect?" Vincent laughed. "Oh, it's not disrespect. It's just realism. Some people are born into one world, others are born into another. It's important that everyone knows their place." Jade felt her mother's hand tighten on her shoulder. She knew that touch. It was Carmen trying to control herself, trying not to explode in front of the boss who paid the bills. "Of course, sir," Carmen replied, her voice tense. "We understand perfectly." "Great," Vincent waved his hand, as if dismissing a pet. "Now, how about we get back to the party? I'm sure there's work to be done in the kitchen." It was at that moment that something changed in Jade's eyes. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper, more determined. She looked at the piano, then at Vincent, then at the dozens of faces around her watching her with curiosity or contempt. "May I ask you a question, sir?" Jade said, her voice clear and calm. Vincent paused, clearly surprised by the change in tone. "Of course, little one. Do you know how to play that piano that's worth $500,000? The question caught Vincent off guard. He blinked a few times, glanced around at the guests who were now paying close attention to the conversation, and then laughed nervously. Well, I appreciate music, obviously. I have a classical education, I studied at. But can you play it?" Jade insisted, her voice still calm but now with an intensity that made some of the adults shift uncomfortably. Vincent opened and closed his mouth, clearly annoyed at being questioned by an 8-year-old in front of his guests. "It's not about knowing how to play, little girl. It's about understanding, about having the proper education, about—" "So you don't," Jade interrupted softly. "But you're sure I don't?" An awkward silence fell over the group. Carmen closed her eyes, knowing her daughter had crossed a dangerous line. Vincent turned red, unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a child. "Jade," Carmen whispered urgently. "Stop." But Jade didn't stop. She walked over to the piano, her small hands reverently touching the keys. "Ms. Martinez always says that music doesn't care where you come from. It only cares if you really feel it." Vincent regained his composure, his voice now laden with irritation. "All right. Very well. If you insist," he gestured dramatically toward the piano, "go ahead. Show us your great talent." The challenge was on. Jade looked at the keys, then at her mother, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, then at Vincent, who watched her with a cruel smile on his lips. "But," Vincent added, his voice loud enough to attract even more attention, "when you can't play anything but Happy Birthday, I want you and your mother to remember this conversation about knowing your place." There, surrounded by dozens of wealthy adults who saw her as entertainment, Jade placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear. They trembled the same way a guitar string trembles before producing a perfect note. Each humiliation only fueled something inside her that those privileged adults couldn't see, a quiet determination being forged by the very injustice they tried to impose on her. What they didn't know was that every word of contempt was writing a lesson they would never forget. The first notes came out of the keys like crystal drops falling into still water. Jade started with something simple, Debussy's Clair de Lune, but there was something about the way she played that made the entire hall fall silent. Vincent had expected a disastrous attempt at Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or perhaps a few poorly executed chords that would confirm his worldview. Instead, Jade's small fingers danced across the keys with a precision that defied her age and background. "My God," whispered someone in the crowd. Carmen watched, petrified, her hands clenched against her chest. She knew Jade was talented, but she had never seen her play on a real piano, on a Steinway that cost more than her house. Vincent frowned, clearly annoyed. This wasn't going according to the script he had imagined. "It's a simple song," he said loud enough to be heard. "Any child who has had a few lessons can play that." Jade stopped in the middle of the piece and looked up at him. "You're right," she said calmly. "This one is easy." Without warning, she began something completely different. The notes of Liszt's La Campanella filled the air, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. Her fingers flew across the keys at impossible speeds, every note crystal clear and perfect. The crowd gasped. Even professional musicians struggle with that composition. To see an 8-year-old execute it with such mastery was simply surreal. "That's impossible," Vincent muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. That's when a voice cut through the air from across the hall. "Actually, it's quite impressive." Everyone turned to see a gray-haired man approaching. It was Jonathan Wells, the city's most respected music critic and the party's special guest. His articles in the New York Times could make or break musical careers. "Mr. Wells," Vincent quickly regained his composure. "I didn't know you had arrived." Jonathan ignored Vincent completely, walking straight to the piano where Jade was still playing. "Where did you learn Liszt, young man?" Jade finished the current passage before answering. "My teacher, Mrs. Martinez. She said that if I could play Liszt, I could play anything." "Mrs. Martinez?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Eleanor Martinez?" "Yes, sir. Do you know her?" Jonathan laughed, a genuine sound of pleasure. "Do I know her?" "Little girl, Eleanor Martinez was the principal pianist of the New York Philharmonic for 15 years. She's a legend." The silence that followed was awkward for Vincent. Carmen felt her legs tremble. She hadn't known that the kind neighbor who taught Jade for free had such credentials. "Eleanor never mentioned she was teaching anyone," Jonathan continued, studying Jade with renewed interest. "She retired 5 years ago and turned down dozens of students from the musical elite." "Why did she choose you?" Jade thought for a moment. "She said I had musical hunger. That it wasn't about having money to pay for expensive lessons, but about feeling the music here," she tapped her chest. "Really?" Vincent tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Wells, surely you're not suggesting that this child has more musical talent in her little finger than most Juilliard students?" Jonathan interrupted. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting." The tension in the room was palpable. Vincent felt his control of the situation slipping through his fingers like sand. Talent is one thing, but formal education, cultural refinement, proper exposure. "Vincent," Jonathan turned to him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May I ask a question? How many times have you played this $500,000 piano in the last 12 months? Vincent opened and closed his mouth. Well, I've been busy with business. While this young lady," Jonathan gestured to Jade, "practices 3 hours a night on a $50 digital keyboard and can play Liszt with the precision of a professional." Carmen felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't know anyone had noticed Jade's dedication. The nights she practiced silently with headphones on so as not to wake the neighbors. Jade looked at Jonathan, then at Vincent, then at her mother. "Can I play another song?" "Please," Jonathan said, making an elegant gesture. "No," Vincent interjected sharply. "I think that's enough spectacle for one night." The comment was like a slap in the face. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jade lowered her eyes, finally showing her age. That's when Jonathan did something unexpected. He sat down next to Jade on the piano bench. "How about we play together? Do you know Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 foot?" Jade's eyes lit up. "4 hands. 4 hands." They began to play together, Jonathan taking the lower part while Jade led the main melody. The music was complex, dramatic, full of changes in rhythm and dynamics that required perfect synchrony between the musicians. But they played as if they had been partners for years. Jade anticipated Jonathan's changes, he followed her interpretive variations. It was a musical conversation of professional caliber. When they finished, the applause was deafening. Not the polite applause of before, but a genuinely emotional ovation. People wiped away tears, others shouted bravo. Vincent was pale, realizing that he had completely lost control of the situation. His charity event had turned into an unauthorized recital starring a child he had tried to humiliate. Jonathan stood up and held out a card to Carmen, who had approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to talk to you about your daughter's educational options. I know of some programs." "She's not going anywhere," Vincent interrupted, his voice heavy with irritation. "This is my party, my house, and I decide." "Decide what, exactly?" Jonathan turned to him, his voice dangerously calm. "Whether a child with exceptional talent should be given opportunities. Whether musical merit should be determined by zip code." The entire room watched the confrontation. Vincent felt dozens of eyes on him, including some of his biggest investors and business partners. That's not what this is about. It's about order, structure, maintaining certain. "Certain what, Vincent?" Jonathan's voice echoed through the silent hall. "Finish the sentence." Vincent realized he had walked himself into a trap. Any words he chose now would make him look exactly what he was, a rich man who believed that talent and opportunity should be determined by birth, not merit. Jade watched silently, her hands still resting gently on the keys. At 8 years old, she was witnessing a lesson in power, privilege, and how people reveal who they truly are when they feel threatened. At that moment, while Vincent struggled to find words that wouldn't condemn him in front of his own guests, something extraordinary was happening. Jade was no longer just a black girl asking to play the piano. She had become the catalyst for a conversation that these privileged people had spent their entire lives avoiding. But what they didn't know was that this was only the first note of a symphony of change that was about to echo far beyond the walls of that penthouse. Vincent was cornered, and he knew it. His face drained of color when he realized that half of his most important guests were filming Jade's performance on their cell phones. Worse still, some had already posted on social media with glowing comments about the young prodigy discovered at the Ashworth party. "Vincent," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the tense silence that followed the applause. "I need to tell you something interesting. You know I've been a music critic for 25 years, right?" Vincent nodded nervously, not liking the tone of the conversation. "In all those years, I've seen talent wasted because of prejudice. I've seen opportunities denied because of arrogance, but never," Jonathan paused dramatically, "never have I witnessed someone try to humiliate a child with exceptional talent in front of 200 people." A murmur ran through the room. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, others whispered among themselves. "Mrs. Thompson," Jonathan addressed Carmen, who was still visibly shaken. "Your daughter just performed Liszt with the technical precision of a conservatory graduate. How old is she exactly?" 8 years old, sir," Carmen replied, her voice trembling with emotion. 8 years old, Jonathan repeated, looking directly at Vincent. "And you thought it was appropriate to publicly question whether she knew her place?" Vincent tried to recover. "Listen, Wells, you're taking this out of context. I just contextualize." A woman's voice cut through the air. It was Margaret Foster, editor-in-chief of Cultural Elite magazine and one of the most influential guests at the party. "Vincent, I have this all recorded on my phone. You literally said that some people are born into one world and others into another, and that everyone should know their place." Vincent felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Margaret Foster had the power to destroy reputations with a single article. "What's more," Margaret continued, holding up her phone, "I posted a video of Jade's performance on my Instagram 5 minutes ago. It already has 15,000 views, and the comments are enlightening about the host's behavior." Carmen held Jade's hand tighter, still processing how the situation had completely reversed. His daughter had gone from the target of humiliation to the center of admiration in a matter of minutes. "Vincent," said Robert Chun, one of Vincent's biggest investors in real estate, "I need to talk to you in private. Now." Vincent knew that tone meant serious trouble. Chun represented a group of Asian investors who valued the public reputation of their partners extremely highly. "Jade," Jonathan knelt down to the girl's height. "I'd like to do something special. How about we play one last song together? Something that shows all these people here what real music is." Jade looked at her mother, who nodded with tears in her eyes. "Do you know Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue?" Jonathan asked. Jade's eyes lit up. "That's one of my favorites." They took their places at the piano again. This time, there was no side conversation, no distractions. 200 people watched in absolute silence. The music that came out of that piano was pure magic. Jade played with a passion that transcended her age, each note loaded with emotion, history, pure talent that couldn't be bought or inherited. Jonathan accompanied her perfectly, but he made it clear that she was the star. When they finished, the silence lasted for long seconds before exploding into emotional applause. People were crying openly. Some shouted bravo, in multiple languages. Vincent watched it all with a mixture of horror and fascination. His party had become completely about Jade, and there was nothing he could do to regain control. "Vincent," Margaret Foster approached him, still recording with her cell phone. "Would you like to comment on this young lady's exceptional talent? Perhaps a public retraction." Before he could respond, Jonathan stood up and made an announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to announce that, on behalf of the New York Conservatory of Music, I am offering a full scholarship to Jade Thompson, including housing for her and her mother, and every educational opportunity her exceptional talent deserves." The hall erupted in even louder applause. Carmen collapsed in tears, hugging Jonathan, then Jade, then anyone nearby. Vincent stood in the middle of his own hall, watching as his attempt to humiliate a child had turned into the most important moment of her life. All around, his guests filmed, posted, celebrated, all focused on Jade and her victory. His phone began to vibrate incessantly. Instagram notifications, text messages, emails. The story was spreading across the internet at a frightening speed, and he wasn't the hero of the narrative. Robert Chun approached him again. "Vincent, our group of investors has decided to reconsider our partnership. We can't be associated with this kind of behavior." There, at the center of his own social empire, Vincent Ashworth watched his reputation crumble note by note, while an 8-year-old girl he had tried to belittle became the most talked-about musical sensation in town. As cell phone flashes captured every moment of Jade's rise, one question hung in the air: could a simple piano performance rewrite not only the fate of a child, but expose the deep cracks in a world that had always pretended that merit and birth were one and the same? 6 months later, the video of Jade playing La Campanella in the Ashworth penthouse had surpassed 2 million views on YouTube. The video's title, "8-Year-Old Girl Humiliates Prejudiced Billionaire with Extraordinary Talent," had gone viral in dozens of languages. Jade now lived in a comfortable apartment near the New York Conservatory of Music, where she studied full-time. Carmen had quit her catering job to devote herself completely to her daughter's education, thanks to a full scholarship that covered all her needs. "Mom, look!" Jade shouted, running across the living room with an envelope in her hands. "Carnegie Hall wants me to play at the Young Talent concert." Carmen smiled, hugging her daughter. 6 months ago, they had barely enough money to pay the rent. Now Jade was being sought after by the best concert halls in the country. Jonathan Wells had kept all his promises. In addition to the scholarship at the conservatory, he had connected Jade with the best teachers in the city and arranged performances that established her reputation as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. "Jade has a gift that transcends technique," he said in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine. "In 40 years of music criticism, I have rarely seen such pure and genuine talent. She doesn't just play music, she tells stories that touch the soul." Meanwhile, Vincent Ashworth watched his life fall apart piece by piece. The viral video had sparked a series of journalistic investigations into his business practices. Margaret Foster had published a devastating article in Cultural Elite entitled "The True Face of the Elite: How Prejudice Rules the Halls of Manhattan." 3 of his biggest investors had withdrawn their capital from his projects. Robert Chun not only canceled the $200 million partnership, but also influenced other Asian investors to avoid any association with Vincent. Victoria Ashworth had filed for divorce, taking half the assets and moving to the Hamptons. "I can no longer be associated with this kind of behavior," she told the New York Post. "It does not represent the values I want for my family." The penthouse where it all happened was now up for sale, with Vincent desperately trying to liquidate assets to cover his mounting debts. His attempts to control the damage to his reputation only made matters worse, especially when a journalist discovered that he had graduated from a prestigious university without ever learning to play the piano he valued so highly as a status symbol. "It's ironic," Jonathan commented on his weekly classical music podcast. A man who owned a $500,000 Steinway never learned to play a single note, while a girl with a $50 keyboard was mastering Liszt. Carmen watched Jade practice on her new Yamaha piano, a gift from Jonathan. The girl played Rhapsody in Blue, with a musical maturity that impressed even the most experienced teachers at the conservatory. "Jade," Carmen called during a break. "Do you remember that night in the penthouse?" Jade stopped playing and smiled. "I do. That's when I learned that some people confuse money with talent, social status with real value." "And what else did you learn?" "That music doesn't lie," Jade replied, her words carrying a wisdom beyond her 8 years. "When you really play with your heart, it doesn't matter where you came from or how much money your parents have. Music shows who you really are inside." 6 months after the night that changed their lives, Jade took the stage at Carnegie Hall for her first solo performance. In the audience, Carmen cried with pride, sitting next to Jonathan and Eleanor Martinez, who had flown in from Los Angeles especially for the concert. Across town, Vincent watched the live webcast in his rented apartment in Queens, where he had moved after losing his penthouse. His empire had crumbled, his friends had abandoned him, and his arrogance had turned to bitter regret. On the screen, he watched Jade receive a standing ovation from 3,000 people. The same girl he had tried to humiliate was now being applauded by New York's cultural elite, many of whom had been present on that fateful night. When the first notes of La Campanella filled Carnegie Hall, Vincent closed his laptop and rested his head in his hands. He had lost everything trying to prove that talent depended on birth and privilege. Jade had proven that true excellence knows no social boundaries. The lesson was crystal clear. Vincent tried to diminish Jade, but ended up diminishing only himself. Jade learned that true success doesn't come from proving you're better than your detractors, but from becoming so extraordinary that they become irrelevant. Years later, when Jade would become one of the most respected pianists in the world, people would still ask her about that night that transformed her from an unknown girl into an international sensation. Her answer was always the same: "It wasn't the music that changed my life, it was discovering that true strength comes from never letting anyone define your limits." If this story of overcoming adversity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that prove that true talent always finds a way, no matter what obstacles try to block it.